I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator Chris Coons discussed the impact the war in Ukraine is having on global food security during a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee hearing Wednesday. He said that this disaster is, quote, compounded by a second global ongoing crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's listen into the Delaware Senator's full opening statement.
Of the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations of the Senate Appropriations Committee to order. The purpose of today's hearing is to hear testimony from 6 exceptionally experienced witnesses concerning 2 of the most urgent crises confronting our world today. The ongoing destruction of cities and the daily atrocities committed by Russian forces against defenseless Ukrainian civilians outrages and offends the sensibilities of all of us. But we should also be concerned, even alarmed, about the widening food security crisis that this needless and brutal war by Russia is causing for hundreds of millions far beyond Eastern Europe. Before the war began in Ukraine, more than 50 countries, including nations like Ethiopia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, were facing acute food shortages due to prolonged drought and conflict. And today their circumstances are markedly worse. As we'll hear from our first panel of 3 witnesses, the collapse of exports of grain and vegetable oil from Ukraine, combined with inflation and higher costs for fertilizer, fuel, and transportation, have caused commodity prices to skyrocket. Latest UN information says the total number of people hungry has increased to 273 million, more than doubling the number living in hunger in 2019. Millions are at risk of starvation, and some estimates are even higher. This food security crisis is compounded by a second ongoing global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, triggering complex humanitarian emergencies on several continents that threaten economic, social, and political stability. While the number of Americans hospitalized and dying from COVID has declined significantly after Omicron peaked in January, it is again rising sharply in a number of our states, and this pandemic is far from over with us. COVID-19, I'll remind you, originated halfway around the world, and we are no less vulnerable to this pandemic today from a global perspective than we were a year ago. Roughly 2/3 of Americans are fully vaccinated, but worldwide, billions are not. And they are concentrated mostly in countries where the virus continues to spread and in countries with weak or fragile public health systems that struggle to respond to this ongoing challenge. Global campaigns against HIV/AIDS, malaria, TB, polio, and other infectious diseases long led by American funds or initiative have stalled or lost ground. And there is a very real risk to our nation and the world that new COVID variants will emerge overseas, causing a sudden resurgence of potentially deadly infections. That might force another lockdown that would threaten to once again shutter businesses, schools, public transportation, and government offices. If we can increase global vaccine coverage, we can dramatically reduce the spread of the virus and the incidence of new variants, protecting everyone, including Americans. As we consider our president's request for emergency supplemental military and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and other countries impacted by the food crisis in Ukraine, our challenge is determining how the United States can best respond to these interrelated global challenges. The president's request initially included about $1.8 billion for food aid, which in my view fell far short of what is urgently needed. Senator Graham and I have both called for at least $5 billion. And I am optimistic, given the action in the House last night, that that amount will be in the final supplemental. The president's request for $5 billion in emergency funding for global COVID response was submitted in March and has not yet been acted on by this Congress. As the Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for providing the relevant funding, we're looking to our 6 witnesses this afternoon to help us understand what the COVID virus is doing, what we should most be concerned about, how their organizations and other donors are responding, and their recommendations so we can make the strongest case to our colleagues in the Senate. Any successful global response against the COVID pandemic requires United States leadership and resources. I also want to emphasize in closing that we are in a critical global strategic situation as well, because dozens of countries and millions of people were forced to rely on Chinese and Russian vaccines, which have ultimately proven ineffective against the Omicron variant. We have an opportunity, 20 years after the PEPFAR program was launched, to once again demonstrate that the United States is a reliable global public health partner, and we should take that chance. Before introducing the first panel, I'll turn to my ranking member, and wanted to express my gratitude to my colleague, Senator Graham, who has been a strong partner and advocate for additional funding to address both these crises. For any opening remarks you'd care to make.